Welcome to the Theorizing the Web 14. This is the Keynote Plenary, Race and Social Media. Before I begin, I'd ask you to give one more round of applause to the organizers and volunteers of this conference. Don't rest your hands just yet. We should also thank the presenters, presiders, attendees, and hash mods of this conference as well for making this an awesome conference for us to present. So I think this is going to go beauty pageant style, where I call out each panelist's name and they're going to sashay or walk right behind me to the chairs. So we'll just go in the order that I have. So we'll start with Latoya Peterson. On Twitter, at Latoya Peterson, who is owner and editor of Racialicious and a John S. Knight Journalism 2012, how about you update this biography, 2013 fellow at Stanford University, focusing on mobile technology and digital access.
I don't
Jenna Wortham, at Jenny Deluxe, is a technology reporter for the New York Times, and on the side, she has an underground internet radio show called Heartline, which she neglected to provide us a URL for. Ayesha Siddiqi is a writer and cultural critic, editor of The New Inquiry, and editor of the new BuzzFeed Ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, La Patronne, Lisa Nakamura, professor of screen arts and cultures and American culture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where I'm lucky to be her colleague. Really doesn't need any introduction to this audience, I don't think, but I'll go ahead and read. She is the author of Digitizing Race, Visual Cultures of the Internet, of Cybertypes, Race, Ethnicity, Identity on the Internet, and co-author of Race in Cyberspace and Race After the Internet. She's writing a new monograph on social inequality and digital media culture, entitled Workers Without Bodies Towards a Theory of Race and Digital Labor. And because I'm a dork, I forgot to say Ayesha's Twitter name, which is @PushingHoops, and Lisa is L. Nakamura. And finally, I am at André. I'm a critical cultural researcher, and I study racial and ethnic representations in games, new media, and internet culture. Okay, so each panelist is going to make a brief presentation, no more than about 10 to 15 minutes. Nathan, 10 to 15?
You said 8?
Yeah. Or less.
Or less, right? Because I want this to be a discourse, not just panels talking to people, right? Followed by a Q&A in which the audience is encouraged to participate by posting questions to my hash mod, the lovely Miss Maggie Mann, right? On Twitter using the hashtags TheorizingTheWeb14, TtW14, and F3. I'm also going to ask you to observe some ground rules for this discussion. This is in addition to the well-crafted conference code of conduct. Given that discussions on race can be extremely heated, I'm asking that you treat this physical space and the Twitter back channel as safe space. That is, the primary mode of discourse should be respectful, no snark, minimize your subtweeting, and if you must perform for attention, at least be funny. Before we begin, I'm going to try to implant a seed in the panelist's mind and ask you to consider the concept of infrastructure as ideology, which I'm pulling from last night's awesome panel on big data, right? And with that being said, Lisa has graciously volunteered to go first, so we'll begin with Dr. Lisa Nakamura.
Wow, hearing you read the things I've written, I'm thinking, can I combine the words race and internet in any new way at all? Probably not. I am thrilled to be here because I am a CUNY graduate. I graduated with an English degree in 1996 with a dissertation on Henry James and Rudyard Kipling. And I'm really proud to see what you've organized. CUNY has never been a school with the most resources, but it has always been a school that can do the most with what it has. And so I'm thrilled to be here. I think public education is really vital. Public higher education is under a lot of threat. And so I think this is definitely an insiders conference. I'm really glad to be talking to you. And CUNY is really one of the most exciting, dynamic spaces for critical theory right now, which I think is wonderful. And I'm also pleased to be here with some really wonderful public intellectuals who've been enriching the conversation on race, gender, and identity in places where academics don't get listened to, and don't get read, or have any attention paid to them. I think that's really key because this topic is huge. So because this is a theory conference, according to the title, I'm going to start with some race theory. In recent years, theorists like Jody Malamed, Rod Ferguson, if you're in the race world, these probably sound familiar to you, have been focusing on formations of inequality around settler colonialism, indigeneity, critiques of multicultural liberalism, as overly concerned with representation, words, and not enough with resource redistribution, money, property, infrastructure, right? There's been a turn as well to the affective and material aspects of race and away from the semiotic. So not as many textual reading, not as much looking at representation. Racist and sexist discourse online is indeed a set of signs and symbols to be parsed and decoded. Some of that work is really important and is still being done. But deconstructing it is ultimately unfixable in its meaning. Slipping perpetually is not really what people are doing in race theory anymore. Instead, people are focusing a lot more on feeling, bodily experience, material conditions, affect, and ultimately trauma, right? The idea of the trigger or the trauma. Malamed and Ferguson talk about multiculturalism as a failed project. And so when you spend a lot of time on the internet, you can see that this is maybe true, right? If the goal of multiculturalism was to produce an internal sense of rightness or social justice in people, many times the internet doesn't really seem to have done that, though I'm gonna give a more balanced perspective later. So hence the internet trigger warning, right? The invocation of a trauma, a bodily experience which is intolerable, painful, repetitive. Racist discourse is designed to invoke these feelings, feelings of rage, shame, humiliation, powerlessness, to produce these strong forms of affect in another. As researchers, we worry about how to handle this kryptonite. Can we reproduce it in our slides without triggering audiences or readers? And I've talked to a couple of presenters who kind of come across this problem. Dara Byrne talked about it. Adrienne Massanari gave us a trigger warning in her presentation on Reddit. But how can we do our work otherwise? Can we hack into these technologies of feeling, especially given the uneven and unexpected consequences that incessant exposure to racism online has produced in a more global way? So I'm going to talk about trolling right now, because I've seen this as a metaphor that's traveled quite a lot, all kinds of different places. Racist trolling is the attempt to instrumentalize feeling, to engineer abjection, to find a way to game the attention economy. The result is that racism online is ubiquitous. It has become, paradoxically, completely empty. It's the nuclear option that's been deployed so many times that it has become absolutely emptied out of meaning. As Kishana Gray's excellent study on Xbox racism found, abusive gamers, quote, view their behavior as annoying, not racist. One abusive player, when confronted about using the N-word, her word, explained, "It's just a stupid word, I just say it to fuck with people." To this player, the word means nothing. To call internet racism trolling is to minimize it as an act that is not really about racism. It's not targeting an individual, right? But fundamentally about something far more benign. Often the people who do it think it's not about anything. So trolling is a euphemism used to dismiss and minimize hate speech, and often figured as a glitch, right? A failure of a system that should be working smoothly to be about something else. A glitch is a sign that something mechanical or electrical has misfired or gone wrong. And yet it's also a sign of exactly the opposite. Trolling is a sign that the network is robust. Any network that has a lot of traffic on it is going to have trolls, and it is being used and used hard. I'm thinking about yesterday's back channel around this guy who needed to be actually physically escorted out of the space. So glitches, from the perspective of media archaeologists like Ernst and Kittler, are the voice of the machine speaking. It is the material aspect of computation asserting itself. But racism online is ubiquitous. It cannot really be viewed as off-topic, even when it is. When it appears, it becomes the topic. So it's both signal and noise. Now I'm going to talk about ideology a little bit, because that often has not been fashionable to talk about. Academics are obsessed with affect. You just see it everywhere, it seems. And this year, social media has seen a return to ideologies that place affect at the center. And I'm thinking specifically about teaching at Hunter and CUNY, Kingsborough College, when I was coming up in the 90s. I taught freshman writing, and we all taught This Bridge Called My Back. Everybody taught it, at least a little bit of it. Remember, the personal is the political. This is the year that feelings have returned. I'm thinking especially feels, so many feelings, right? Hashtags like I'm not your Asian sidekick and solidarity is for white women index feeling and experience. Women of color feminism is thriving on Tumblr, something I'm thrilled to see. It's a space outside the academy. I think some of the best critique on race and gender is happening outside of the academy, which is why I'm so thrilled that this group is here. Aggregated in places like Angry Women of Color United, so on. This Bridge Called My Back is out of print. I was shocked to know this. But it is freely available on Tumblr, curated by feminists who urge others to redistribute it freely. Though it's easy to make fun of social justice Tumblrs, and lots of people do, they are spaces of gendered and racialized feeling, affect, that show that algorithms and networks can be designed as content agnostic. They may be intended this way, but in practice are never agnostic. Parsing the logics of this algorithm for what is algorithm but ideology in executable form can help us understand both the disavowal of racism online, quote, it's just an annoying word, and the resurgence of internet-based feminism and anti-racist projects and how they have come to inform our life after new media. Thank you.
Next up will be Ayesha Siddiqi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. That was really interesting and goes along with what I wanted to talk about today, which was what the backlash has been to these movements on Tumblr and Twitter, and what the reception to the increased volume of the voices of women of color, of people in color in general, and how that fits into current media trends. So a lot of the shifts in power that we've seen occur across these social platforms in the past few years, media has spent, the past year scrambling to make sense of that. And there are really two available options. One is to take advantage of these new voices and recognize that these are people who already have compelling things to say, audiences who are interested. There is clearly a demand for that sort of discourse, and that conversation will happen whether or not mainstream outlets recognize it. And so to recognize that and really co-sign those voices and share their platforms with them, invite them to write guest columns. The other available response has been to, reassert the relevancy of irrelevant models. And the places that have just been launched, that have been collectively termed and self-identified as explainer journalism are a really interesting new product because I see them as a direct response to the relevance of streams, of people's feeds, of self-selected feeds that people are engaging with constantly. And so now that punditry no longer holds the same value and space in people's media diets and the way we get our news and information and commentary, people who would have originally identified as pundits are grappling with reasserting their importance and saying, well, no, you do need us, and you need us to explain things. And so what I really see that is there are people who have appreciated what the internet has offered in terms of, not leveling the playing field because the world isn't flat yet, but tilting ever so slightly away from the access that has always privileged the voices of authority, which have always looked white and male. And that tilt away has been perceived as, a devastating shift to some people and inspired a lot of backlash and, terms like outrage Twitter, social justice warrior, call-out culture, whatever it is people want to call the fact that not only now are our voices exposed to, or rather outlets exposed to their criticism, but their audiences are too in real time. And that accountability, I think, is a very new and recent development, and it's it's something that I, as someone who's new to media, is very excited and energized about, and I think it makes our culture stronger, and it's something to be taken advantage of. But I think a lot of people, not everyone agrees with me that the internet has made us smarter, and the people that feel that the internet makes us dumber are the people launching sites here to tell you how to make sense of everything. Oh, let me explain this to you. And that's such a fascinating attitude to have, and I think that's an attitude that's really only available to people who have always been able to not only expect an audience, but identify as an authoritative voice. And instead of, I think, sharing, and I think those same people often mistake the internet as being a finite space, and that does need to grapple to have a few authority figures rather than this, open and dynamic, space that they should be reaching out to and listening to as much as they want to, pontificate to. The other thing that's fascinating about what's happening online in terms of discourse around race and social justice is that these platforms, they quantify validation. And popularity becomes a metric for correctness, and it's something that often proves the inaccuracy of the conventional wisdom and the sort of how out of touch traditional pundits are and have been. And there's a lot of fear associated with that loss of authority. And at the same time, there's a huge movement to not only rationalize and make sense of all these voices, but to dismiss them and place them in very specific niches that, okay, this is, Twitter activism, the idea of adding modifiers that are supposed to remove this practice from, the original, this isn't actual activism, it's something else. And that this is an actual social justice practice. And usually the people using these phrases, social justice, are people who aren't necessarily out in the streets fighting for social justice anyway. They're not really offering alternatives to these practices. But really, I just find it very fascinating, this cultural moment of, if this is this post-authenticity world, if it is this very, we don't distinguish virtual reality from reality anymore, going back to all of the ideas that have been presented over the course of this conference, then there is a new battle for reclaiming authority, and then for others, claiming it for the first time ever. And I think the best answer to that is no longer having the same attitudes about authority and, appreciating that models of engagement are much better for everyone, for a healthier, more robust conversation. And the thing is, these topics, they can't be allowed stagnancy. And so, a typical column with limited physical space can only exist within a certain amount of words because it's only afforded a certain amount of inches, and it's only given to people who had the connections to get that seemingly lifetime appointment to, space in an op-ed page, versus this continuously shifting. I mean, it's so much healthier for these topics to be addressed in spaces that are so quickly moving, that are so dynamic, that have so many access points for people. And it's also just really funny watching those that whose authority and relevancy is now challenged by the internet to struggle to reassert themselves, reassert their voices, and try to project again onto these people, like, oh, you can't also have an opinion column, you're just some girl on Twitter. Or you can't also be subsequently published in, various outlets if you're just someone who's a quote-unquote Twitter activist or a hashtag activist. And honestly, there's nothing more boring to me than when places like The New Yorker want to have a column on what exactly hashtag activism is or what Twitter means, is because you're talking about the tool and not what the product. And many of us, it's not particularly novel that people tweet. We all do. And so I'm more interested in how those conversations are archived in the culture, are continued in the culture in different outlets, how they move from platform to platform, and who gets exposure to them. Because there's no such thing as, like, you know, social media is media now. And it's particularly well suited to handling conversations on race and gender because more so than other outlets, it features those voices. There are fewer barriers to entry, and that's what makes it such a valuable, exciting tool. So when people want to, you know, disparage these places being not polite enough for them, I mean, it just makes me laugh that is what people are choosing to focus on people in traditional outlets, and it really just evinces to me a anxiety about the growing irrelevancy, and it really is a case of you know, either joining this cultural shift or trying to go against it in a very futile manner. So.
That was great. Thank you. That's really good. I'm so excited to be here on this panel with so many smart and amazing people, so I'm very excited. I just want to say that. So I'm a tech reporter for the New York Times, and as part of my day job, I spend a lot of time thinking about not only kind of what companies are getting traction, but what ideas are taking shape and what's kind of, you know, emerging from stuff that, you know, what things that all of us in here do on a day-to-day basis, and when they start to break into a larger mainstream way, and kind of what that means and how it's changing and shaping how we interact, how we do business, how we live our lives, how we relate to each other, and how we sort of start to think differently about those kinds of interactions and economies and just general practices for our daily lives. And those are the kinds of things that I somehow try to translate into business stories. No, they're not, but I do work for the business section, so that's what I do. But so I'm very, very interested in kind of how the tools that we use and the things that are presented and made available to us, they're usually conceived as things that are intended to be used in a very different way than they end up ultimately be using by the majority of the people that use them. And that kind of transformation really fascinates me, and I think a lot about how the technology that is built for us is shaped by us, and then how we are kind of, you know, enhanced or augmented or limited by the nature of the service that we're using. So I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of social media and how it kind of facilitates and hinders and limits and amplifies and boosts topics around of things that are, you know, very, very pertinent and important and, you know, in our daily lives, like sexism and racism and gender and all these different things. So one thing, I've been writing about Twitter since, I mean, I got a job at the New York Times because I was writing about Twitter before anyone really knew what Twitter was, and I used to work at Wired, and we looked into the Twitter offices, so I've been thinking about Twitter and what this tool means for a very long time. And I think this year has been a fascinating year, because we went from, in the very early days of Twitter, is using it for, or Twitter or Tumblr, let's just say social media in general. We went from using these services as a way to talk about our daily lives and our daily experiences, and then, you know, going out and saying, where's a place to get, you know, lunch on Twitter? Like, I'm in California for the day. Like, what do I do in San Francisco? You know, we went from taking these very, very, very basic, like super basic, rudimentary, like queries and putting them out on Twitter to using it as a place where we have these incredibly complex and serious and, you know, very, very relevant, far-flung conversations about lots of things, but mostly racism. And 2014, I feel like, is the year that everyone started talking about race online, or at least in a way that everyone was paying attention to it. And that's a really fascinating thing, because we went from actually sort of using the tools the way they were intended to using them in a way that we wanted for stuff that we felt was particularly important and relevant to our lives. And so, as a result of that, that's why we're all here and talking about it. But I think I've been really kind of watching a lot of the things that Ayesha was talking about from a little bit of a distance, because I kind of am more of an observer than a participant in a lot of these various cultural movements as they happen online, because I like to write about them, and I try to remain a little bit of distance and a little bit of presumed objectivity. And I think on Twitter in particular, I wonder a lot about kind of how that tool, you know, how it kind of elevates the conversations that we're able to have. I mean, it's such a very specific medium, and things are kind of constantly being either taken out of context or pulled out of context or pushed forward into a different context, and kind of, you know, are these the best tools? I mean, we're making use of the tools that are already available to us, but they weren't built by people like us. They weren't built by people who were thinking about using them for tools of social justice or for tools, and it's great that they're as widespread as they are. But the question that I always kind of come back to is, are these the best tools to be having the kinds of conversations and affecting the kind of change that we actually want to be having? And why aren't there more of them? And why aren't they better? You know, and people talk about, you know, people have all kinds of opinions about so-called hashtag activism. I mean, it's the thing that's most readily available, and there's something incredibly wonderful, and I'm the kind of person who gets very giddy when something exciting is kind of happening on the internet, and it makes me very happy when voices that traditionally wouldn't have had the same kind of elevation as a columnist at the New Yorker or a columnist at the New York Times is heard by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, because they wrote something that was a truth that resonated, and it was a voice that typically would not have had, you know, a platform to speak from, has access to it, and that's an incredible, incredible thing. But the flatness of Twitter and the flatness of social media, and by flatness I just mean there's often very little context. It's so ephemeral that we're kind of coming in at a moment. It's like you're putting a quarter into a slot, you know, peep show, and you get this little brief kind of window goes up and you're seeing this thing that's happening, but we very often don't know where it started, who's behind it, if we're for it or against it. It's often very hard to get our bearings in the stream because that's sort of what's available to us. But I often wonder how it kind of makes it easy to, for the people that need to, I don't know, be thinking about this, to ignore us. I mean, it's easy for, you know, it's easy to sort of say, well, a lot of people on Twitter are mad about this, like, oh, that's such a cliche. You know, it's like, I'm just thinking so much. I think I really just would love for there to be, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of, you know, technologists and developers and people in here, and I'm kind of encouraging you to think about this too, and think about how we can kind of take the kind of conversations that we're having right now and that we've been having online and we've been having for years and, you know, been talking about in our various ways, online and offline, and how do we, you know, we all know these lessons. We all know the things that we need to know about, you know, or for the most part, or we're at least open to discussing them. We're all here because we're interested in kind of how social media helps and perpetuates and, you know, hinders and limits racism and sexism and all the bad isms that, you know, we all are concerned about. But how do we get that conversation beyond this room? I mean, how do we get the people that need to be paying attention to pay attention to it in a way that's not, doesn't turn into a joke on a late night show, in a way that doesn't turn into a joke in an SNL skit? I mean, that's the stuff that's really interesting to me. And I wonder too about how social media makes it easier or harder, depending on how you look at it. I don't know. It makes it easier or harder for cultural appropriation, or, you know, more trauma or more harm to be perpetuated. You know, I wonder. I don't know. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. And the last thing I wanted to say is, and this is just more of a general observation, I guess, and commentary, but I do find it to be very fascinating that, you know, we do have this new arsenal of tools and services to be heard and to talk about the things that are actually really important to us besides, and this is such a trope of Twitter, you know, but besides what we had for lunch that day. And that's a wonderful thing. But something that concerns me and troubles me is when I look at these companies and when I look at the, you know, the host of new voices and ideas and things that are emerging through social media, and then I take a step back and look at the companies and the people that are profiting from them and the people who are aggregating the most interesting tweets about, you know, Miley Cyrus's video, right, where she's like using black dancers and et cetera. Like those organizations that are kind of, you know, pulling that commentary, are they doing that instead of actually hiring writers that would actually be able to write about them? I mean, is this standing in place for, you know, actually, I don't know, becoming, I mean, I guess my point is I feel like, you know, the diversity and the awareness and the thoughtfulness that we're kind of seeing emerge, and the heatedness, the anger, right? All these things that are emerging on Twitter about the kind of state of things and the ideas that we want to go viral. We don't want, not talking about videos or GIFs going viral. There are ideas. There are certain ideas that we want to go viral and to actually, move out beyond our kind of social media sphere. I don't see that happening at a higher level yet, and I wonder if it's going to happen. But I definitely, Twitter is not a very diverse company in terms of people of color or women that work there. Neither is Facebook. They're getting better, but they're not great. And so that's something that I just encourage everyone to kind of think about, which is, the disparity between the two and kind of what can be done about it. The same goes for kind of big major news organizations that say, we want to hire diverse writers, but they don't, but then, they say they're having a really hard time finding them, they don't, but then they're aggregating all of our tweets into a slideshow and making money off of that. So, I don't know, these are just food for thought and things that I hope we talk about here today.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to hopefully get my part done in 8 minutes so we can open up to all of your fabulous questions. And if you guys want to pull up the Tumblr post I'm going to refer to, now would be a great time. So essentially, just to start off the story I want to tell. In December of last year, after 8 years of operating more or less under the radar, Racialicious was hacked. And much to my disappointment, we were not hacked by roving bands of white supremacists, though they've been our foils online for many, many years. No, instead we were hacked by people who were selling bootleg Ugg boots, which was extremely disappointing because then everyone assumed it was like this malicious and nefarious attack on us, and really no, it was just somebody was trying to just jack our SEO rating, and everything for the site for about 2 months went to Ugg boots. It was horrific trying to fix this thing. And so in light of that, we finally started engaging on Tumblr, which was a place that we had a Tumblr and we were doing something with it, but we never really had a cause to go for it or to go hard in the paint, so to speak, than when we were hacked, right? So while I was playing around on Tumblr, which I find both mind-blowingly amazing and completely horrifying at the same time, while I was on Tumblr, I ran across the most interesting post. And as usual, as per Tumblr, it wasn't necessarily the source post that was the most interesting, but the commentary underneath it. And so in this one, if you can't read it, it says prairie, which is spelled wrong, mind you. Racists always seem to spell like one key part of the slur wrong. I don't know what that is. It has been consistent in the 10 years I have been doing this. Like, there's always one part that's jacked up. Anyway, so it says prairie niggers, right? And this is actually a racial slur that was lobbed at some First Nations and Indigenous students who were at a particular university. And people were going back and forth online talking about the type of racist graffiti and what should be done and what should happen. And if we scroll down just a tad bit, we'll get to the point that I like. Scrolling down a little bit.
I'm working.
Are you working on it? Okay, there we are. All right, so what I found interesting about this was not necessarily just the existence of the term, right? When you've been doing racial justice work as long as I have, there's always somebody hanging a noose in a college dorm. There's always somebody scrawling racist graffiti on a bathroom wall. Like, these things are always with us. They're very shocking and painful and horrifying. But then when you hear it 50 times, 100 times, 300 times, 600 times, it starts to lose its resonance, right? Because you're looking at it across the nation. You're not just looking at it as this isolated incident that happened on your campus. But what was most interesting to me was one commentator who wrote, prairie nigger, sand nigger. The source of all world niggers trickles down from us. We are the nigger API, and everyone else builds nigger apps on top of our code. And I was like, that is brilliant, right? That is like the best explanation of racism there is. This is what I've been trying to say for 10 years, right? In this one Tumblr comment, this person is clearly like way smarter than I am. But then comes the rub, right? I run a multiracial space. If I reblog this, what does that then do? Because we are using explicit racial slurs in a way that is trying to explain racism. That somehow upholds it if it is viewed in the wrong context. And so I went back and forth, do I post this, do I not post this, do I post this, do I not post this? So I ended up posting this really long comment, which we will not talk about right now, and this caveat. And one of the things I had mentioned is that had this been Racialicious 2008, the version that we had then, and had this been Racialicious 2010, racial slurs in their full form were fine, right? Because what we were doing, there were a very small group then. 2008, I think we had about 2,000 regular visitors each day, roughly. And it's like the same core 100 or so folks who are in the comments and in the sections and, you know, talking to us and being in community with us. And so in that case, it was fine, because our main goal was to try to get people of different backgrounds to talk to each other. We didn't want to be afraid of words and to dance around things, the N-word, we think this, we think that, but to really just say it, right? Because we're looking at the way in which we give words power, and one of the ways in which we give these types of words power is to make it so it's unsayable, except for people who want to diminish you, except for people who want to take the piss out of you, which is why, again, this nigger API thing is so fascinating, all right? It's fascinating, because what is the worst thing to call someone, right? What is the worst thing? By logic, you can't call somebody a prairie nigger. You can't call them a sand nigger, because nigger is specifically a slur for black people, and you are talking to people who are not black. It doesn't make any sense. Racism has no logic, right? Because it's a social construct. They do whatever they want. It's like Monopoly. Fuck it. I'm going to be a banker. I feel like doing it. It's fine, right? Like, do what I want to do, right? Free parking. But that makes things extremely complicated for those of us who are trying to have interesting and transformative conversations online. Because when you start deploying these types of terms, right, just the fact that all of these small band of, I'll say, racial activists that hang out on racial issues will look at this nigger API and go, interesting. We're also exposing it to people who would never come across these terms but suddenly feel like they have permission to use this racial slur, because we've used it now in a context trying to take power from it and instead ended up putting more power into this term, right? It's kind of like when your white friends watch the Boondocks and you go, which friend is this, right? Is this my Asher Roth friend or is this my Bubba Sparks friend? It's different types, right? It's different things. Because what it ultimately comes down to, and what we try to build, and I think what gets lost in all of these conversations about race that we have online, is that we're trying to build trust, right? We're trying to talk to each other. And again, none of this is new, right? Back in the 60s, activists tried to popularize this term called niggerization, right? Flo Kennedy was the most famous of these. And she was talking about niggerization in terms of just disempowering somebody to the most basic levels. And people were banning about it, and she famously said that you don't have to be black to be niggerized. You can be old, you can be a woman, you can be this, you can be that. But again, the same thing happened there. Those conversations immediately imploded. Those conversations started to die because that word was just too volatile. How many of you guys are familiar with slut walk and the controversy that erupted when a young white woman hoisted a "woman is the nigger of the world" sign? She was doing it to make commentary on gender and gender solidarity and the need for gender solidarity. But she did not do this in explicit racial solidarity, which is where the problems came. Can you appropriate my pain, my slurs, things that would be on my body, if we are not in conversation together toward the same goal? Right? In the same way that I wouldn't approach Lisa Nakamura about Asian American slurs or things that would be thrown at her body because those are not mine. And in the same way, I feel comfortable speaking to a mixed room of people using a full slur that would be aimed at my body because it is mine to do with what will and I please. That's what I was trying to say. Thank you. All right, because it is mine and it's on my body, and it's one of those things that I have to engage with every single day as a black person, as a black female, that just doesn't happen for other folks. So what happens when we try to be in explicit community together, in explicit conversation together, when we don't necessarily have that trust built up and when we are not speaking from the same point, right? How do we understand that? How do we understand that? How are we able to talk about things like anti-blackness undergirding a lot of what American racism looks like without playing the oppression Olympics and saying that your racism and your racism and your racism doesn't matter? How do we give people something constructive to do if they are not the people who would have the burden of racism placed upon them? When you might want to help, but it's not something that's quite where you are. So, in reblogging the nigger source code API conversations, we thought about these things and how do you put them in the world and how do you have these conversations about them, and realizing that unfortunately there might not be an answer, which is why we're still struggling with this problem 400 years on.
So I'm going to do the what should not be difficult job of trying to synthesize what's been said here, but in an effort to push the conversation a little further. The four of you have in common, apart from your gender, the ways in which you're talking about in various ways the internet is infrastructure. Yes, I'm back on infrastructure again, right? And what seems to me to be spoken but not quite explicit, and perhaps I could ask you guys to expand for the audience, is how you understand the internet as both enabling and disabling the types of conversations that Latoya is asking about multicultural competence, right? And I think it's particularly, and so I'll go down the line and say how I think this is relevant to each of your stuff, right? So Lisa in particular, is glitch racism only offensive when it's explicit? What about the implicit, subtweet, ways that people come at you sideways? Sideways is a black euphemism for when I'm not talking to you directly. The way people come at you sideways when in online conversations to try to diminish your authority. For Ayesha, when you're talking about Twitter as a space for the creation of nascent social publics, my question for you then is, how do you surface those social publics without an explainer? Right? Who gets to, how do you identify when a Twitter topic is developing enough for people to pay attention to that is important to them? Or is that something you should leave to the people themselves to decide? Right? For Jenna, the question is kind of similar, right? Is there a space, does it have to be a space created by people of color in order for it to be a space where everybody can exist in comedy, right? And not comedy, committee, right? And then Latoya, I'm gonna make you start this off because you went last, but the question I have for you is, what exactly is it that Tumblr does that racialists could not do?
Woo! That's a hell of a question.
Right.
Well, it's one, like, a good question. Oh, yeah, nice.
Since so many people are talking about Tumblr this weekend as a space where resistance happens, where feminism takes place.
Man, I don't know about all that. Hold, pause. Okay? And I say this as an old school blogger, not quite weblog blogger, but close, right? And so Tumblr is a new platform.
Yes.
It is the same activity that has been done. And I feel like if I keep looking at like Sojourner Truth's archives, because you know we had a fight on the internet in the blogosphere before Tumblr was cool, before Tumblr was invented. Oh my God, what am I talking about? Before Tumblr was cool, we had a conversation about like how feminists support their work and what you sell. And then I found like an art exhibit that was unrelated, like 3 years later. There were postcards from Sojourner Truth that she was selling to fund her talks, right? And she was saying, I sell the shadow to fund the substance, right? So it's like, none of this stuff is new. It cycles, it cycles, it cycles. What can Tumblr do? Tumblr allows you to be in an interesting type of conversation, right? Before, racialism is wholly our space, right? And we imposed a comment moderation policy, and we stick to that to this day, right? To this day, comments are still moderated on racialism very heavily. And we look and we're like, okay, this works, this doesn't work, this is not forming conversation, screw you, you're out, done. This is our little private fiefdom, right? It's like our living room at a dinner party, you can come in, do what you want. Tumblr is an interesting mix of both, right? It's kind of like when I read Dana Boyd's work and she's talking about these network publics and teens' expectations of kind of like public privacy. That is what I think about when I think about Tumblr, because I see all of these young social justice activists, mostly young, right, who are on Tumblr and they're looking at all these things and they're tweeting about Franz Fanon and then they're mixing it with porn gifs and I'm just like very confused. And then what ends up happening there is that you can then reblog somebody's post. I like this enough to either comment on it or tear it apart. And then you have these long conversations where everybody is taking pieces of what you've created and putting it on their own personal blog in a way that is not copyright infringement, but in a way that is furthering the conversation, right? It's really interesting stuff. It's furthering conversation, but at the same time, if you intrude upon a conversation that is public but is supposed to be private, you will get yelled at, as I get yelled at all the time on Tumblr for doing. So I stopped talking on Tumblr because I'm like, this is not worth it. So there's this interesting expectation of privacy when I want to be private, an expectation that things will be public and everyone will read what I am saying when I want it to be this way. And I find that interesting. Also, Tumblr is kind of a fire hose, right? So when racialists and all of us old head bloggers, like Angry Asian Man, reappropriate, like all of these folks who were rolling around before with us, Color Lines, Jack and Jill Politics, those folks. I think Color Lines was RaceWire, right? I forget. But all of that at that time, right? There was still this understanding that there was going to be like kind of one central authority, right? That is speaking from this platform. And even though we were speaking in community, it was like separate communities, like, you know, kind of like calling from island to island versus you know, everyone kind of being in the same space, taking small pieces of the pie, going back to little areas and adding to it or changing. So I find that dynamic interesting. I also find that fire hose that Tumblr gives you of the dashboard to be very, very interesting, because this is the first time I've ever seen like young trans kids having not only community, like in the way that we would have found it through chat rooms or other things, but also how-tos, advice, blogs, and to have this part of your own identity continually reaffirmed all of the time when you open up your web browser, which never used to happen, or your mobile, right, which never ever used to happen. There were no affirmative spaces in that way. So those are the key differences I see. But as I always warn people, I own Racialicious, right? And it's hosted, right, by DreamHost, right? So I can always take it off DreamHost, put it somewhere else. If Tumblr closes, that is it, right? As a person who was on Easy Journal, which was a live journal competitor, and lost 7 years of her online life, I warn you about investing too much in platforms you do not own, but we don't have that conversation, and I think Jenna can talk to that more.
What a perfect segue, because I was just sitting here thinking about that as an answer to your question. Yeah. So, I mean, just thinking about your question, I mean, the conversation will happen wherever it needs to happen, whoever, regardless of who made the tool. I mean, the importance of, I guess, the location of these conversations and these interactions, I feel very much like they're agnostic, but in thinking that these tools are neutral, I mean, we're a bit wrong to think that these services are neutral, because we don't own them, and we don't have full control over them, and we feel like we sign up for these accounts and we put our content, we put our information into them, and they do exist for a while and sometimes for a very long while, but these are very real businesses, and they have very real capitalistic motivations, and it is in their best interest for us to use them as long as we make money for them, and that's through advertisers. I mean, they just I don't have anything. I feel like I'm kind of sounding like I'm trying to burn the internet and let's burn our own thing, But I really just feel like there is something to be considered when at some point, if Twitter decided, and I'm not saying they would, and I'm not saying I have no knowledge of what their plans are, but if they felt like, you know what, our advertisers are very uncomfortable by the kinds of conversations that seem to be happening about this particular company, this particular organization. We don't necessarily love this hashtag. They could bury it. I mean, that's not in our power to control, and we would never know. We would not know. And as far as I know, and as far as I can tell, they don't do that, but Tumblr exists as this incredible place, which again, I feel like a kid in a candy store when I'm on Tumblr, because I'm just look at all the shiny people and things, because there's so much there, and there's so much excitement and energy, and I love the way young women use it, and I love the way it's just this incredibly, just all these ideas and things, and yeah, porn gifs and, quotes from a Snapple lid, and all jammed in together, and I fucking love it. I love it. It makes me so happy to just go into down that rabbit hole. But you know what? Tumblr is now owned by Yahoo. Yahoo bought that company because it couldn't figure out how to turn itself into a business, and they don't even own it anymore. So what does that mean? I mean, for now it's up, and they haven't done very much to change it, but that's a very different type of company now. And they can say that they're independent and that they do their own thing, and to some degree that's true. But if their parent company decides, you know what, we're not going to give you guys any more resources because you're not making enough money for us, we haven't figured this out, or we don't like the kinds of conversations that are happening here. We don't like when people talk about race. We don't like when people talk about self-harm. So we're gonna bury all those hashtags. We're gonna bury all those. We're not gonna really promote any of that stuff. It's that's a real concern. And so I guess that's the kind of thing that I think about when I look at the kinds of tools where all this activity is happening. And one thing I wanted to say, and this is maybe a good segue too for Ayesha, but I was thinking a little bit about explainer sites, and I for one, and personally feel very overwhelmed by all the content that we're expected to be aware of, all the time in order to be a functioning human who works in media. It's insane, and I'm trying to get over the need to feel like I know everything that's going on all the time. And I do appreciate an explainer sometimes in the sense of, in the instance of Heartbleed, for example, or that explainer on Vox was wonderful. I was just like, this is great. I work at a company where we're talking about this all day long, and I have basic questions, and they are answered right here, and now I feel smarter. This is wonderful. But then when they sort of tackle, there was one, there was an explainer, and I DM'd with the author about this back and forth, and we had a really nice, long, lovely G-chat about it. Twitter wasn't a place to have this conversation, but there was an explainer about Beyonce being on the cover of Time, and there was this whole, big section on the word basic and how basic was appropriated by different cultural groups and different races. And you know, I just sort of felt like, you know, when there's a small group of people, a small quorum of people who are deciding when something is relevant and why, and what should be said about it, and how that lives that's archived as the truth, that is very problematic to me. And I do think that, you know, there's no way that there's a universally agreed upon set of cultural ideas and assumptions that we're all operating from, or that we all should be operating from. And that's sort of what I think about when I raise this question of the tools that we're using and the services that we turn to for information, because it's a little bit scary to kind of have, you know, the people at the top or the services at the top that are kind of controlling kind of what we're able to talk about and where we're able to talk about that, because there's no way that our viewpoints are ever going to be aligned just because we're all humans. We have different ideas and ideologies and viewpoints. And so that's kind of the hierarchy that I'm sort of thinking about, and that's kind of, I guess, what I'm trying to raise in talking about the tools that we use.
So I'm going to interject, and I don't need a microphone because I'm naturally loud. So I want you guys to think of also platform politics, and shout out to Adrian Masonari for that one earlier today, right? How does the platforms that you're discussing, so whether it's Tumblr, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Vox's explainer site, how do they shape the politics of the people who participate in them? Right? Not just the ideology of the company that's running them, so whether or not Yahoo will ever be popular or profitable is up for debate, but the ways in which they then shape the discourses that are available. So Tumblr with its lack of moderation, right, versus Racialicious with its moderation. Twitter with its context awareness for people who are following each other, but lack of content awareness for people who are just trying to observe the fire hose from a distance. So I want to put that in play as you start to answer your question.
Okay, well, to go off what Jenna's talking about, and you know, another interesting feature of the impulse to explain is that it relies on the stream being the primary source of information for people. Like, there is no explainer without the thing to explain, which is what everyone happens to be talking about, and that constant conversation that we all sort of struggle to keep up with and know what everyone's talking about and why they're talking about it. And so for me, I'm interested in who identifies as explainers and their relationship to the subjects that they want to explain. And it can be very helpful. And there's a great, John Herman wrote in the All about these sites. And I thought he made a great observation that their rhetorical mode is as interruptions. The actually, it's this, the no, but it's this, or this is what you should really think. And without and those work best within the streams, our streams of information, our Twitter feeds, our Facebook feeds. And as standalone sites, it's quite bizarre to maintain that tone of interruption exclusively and without the rest of it, everything that they're trying to explain. And in terms of surfacing, in your original question, Reed, surfacing these conversations and communities, the thing about discourse on Twitter, whether it's around issues of gender or race or both, is that sometimes it's catharsis, sometimes it's education, and both are valuable, but both have very different goals. Sometimes it's just a community of people finding each other and creating the space to talk about topics. And when those topics get popular, I'm not particularly a fan of sites coming in to sort of summarize the hashtag trends and basically, ripping off okay, here are like 15 tweets from this particular hashtag over the weekend. And it's uncomfortable for a few reasons, not only because now it goes from the original community that was participating in something that had very different goals and values for them to something that an outlet is making money off of, but also that, like Jenna said, that I would much rather, if I see an interesting popular hashtag, retweet the hashtag than publish those tweets somewhere else, now that I'm in a position to do so at BuzzFeed. And I would much rather give someone money to write about the topic of the hashtag, whether that's sexual assault or whether that's, for example, racial microaggressions in the workplace, whatever it may be. I'd rather, give someone the space and resources to explore that topic than to hear someone, write about Twitter.
But doesn't
or write about
that
the
make you an
hashtag.
explainer?
or an editor. I mean, and it's a very, very thin line. It's a very, very thin line because, I mean, that is a position of arbitrating what's important and what gets an audience. But I would never call myself an explainer, and that may be the only difference, honestly, is that relationship to, you know, assuming authority.
Right.
And honestly, did I answer your original question, by the way?
Yes, you did.
Okay, good. So then, I'll do Lisa.
Okay, I want there to be more time for conversation.
Okay.
So I'm going to answer your question in a very truncated way, which is to say, when Jenna, you said that something happened in 2014 around race and social media, it did. And I can't exactly say what, but video games like Gone Home, it just seems like there's things like things that are opening up. Yet at the same time, there's this problem, as Latoya was saying, with this kryptonite issue, that now people are so wary. Like now that it's out there, it's almost as if we're all in this playground together, but the yard duty is totally clueless, right? And this is what the algorithm is, it's the yard duty. And it has really no idea what's going on. It's subject to control that we have nothing to do with. It tends to change over in unpredictable ways. You know, things change, we don't know it. So I think the contribution scholars have is to be mindful and to demystify what that yard duty is doing. Because people are in there, and like Latoya says, I'm going to do what I want to do, right? I mean, that's where a lot of racist discourse comes from. It's this feeling of, I am in a space where I can now shout the word nigger over and over again, and people have done this. I mean, I've been in conferences where that's happened in the Twitter stream, literally. It was 4chan, right? Nigger, nigger. And so, you know, the desire to do this is totally, I think, fueled by this project of multiculturalism. People came up and they're like, PC, I hate it. How dare you tell me what to do? I'm going to do what I want to do. And so seeing the algorithm as both very political, but as the thing that doesn't know, right? It does not know what is going on really, and yet it has all this power, I think is one way to see it, for me anyway. So can we turn to the floor now?
Heck
Some
yeah.
questions?
Maggie, do we have any great questions from Twitter?
No great questions have been submitted to me yet, but there's a lot of people commenting and great things being said here in the room.
Okay. Come on up to the microphone, ladies and germs. I'm not going to recognize you. Just walk up to the microphone.
The microphone's for the feed, so...
So should I talk into the microphone?
Hi.
Hi.
The mic, but also speak it.
Really interesting conversation. This is primarily a question for Jenna and Lisa. It came up in a panel I was on earlier, and I'm wondering how far down, you both sort of touched on this, how far down this conversation extends to the substrate of the technologies that are actually being used to convene these conversations. And I know, Lisa, your work on menu-driven identities kind of connects to this a little bit. But, you know, I live in San Francisco, and there are a lot of people who look like me who are working at these companies that are creating these forums in which these kinds of conversations occur, and yet we don't sort of critically interrogate the net effect of those modes of sociality and interaction being sort of built into the fiber of how we talk to each other online.
I'm going to let you finish, but I just want to say one word.
That's
GitHub, right? How does GitHub manage to manifest this atmosphere of sexism and misogyny and patriarchy if it's just a code base, right? So I think you have a great question, but I'll let the actual people you wanted to answer.
I don't know. I'm not sure what to think about that for a second. Do you want to go, Lisa?
We will register that as a very
Yeah,
It's a
interesting
very
question.
good question.
It's a really, really, really good question. I want to just think about it for a little bit longer. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I will say one thing though. One of the things that's been of interest to me since I started doing writing about social media is how much attention is paid to blogs, but not necessarily to blog comments. Like, I think it's long overdue that people start paying attention to the ways Discus, Livefire, Facebook comments, and the like allow and constrain certain types of discourse, right? And some of that is moderation policies for the individual sites that do embeds, but there's also something to be said for the format of the comment, particularly as they move to threaded, that encourage people to not only spew stuff that was vile to other people, but then magnify it and get into arguments with them about it. And I think that's something that directly ties to your question about substrates. I think that mechanical form of the commenting thread has done a lot to increase the types of problematic discourse that we're talking about here. Sorry for the use of problematic.
No, I think that's true. Like Latoya was saying, you know, these words have become so toxic and so confusing for people. Right, so you see the banhammer come down on someone who's using the word in a critical way. And I was thinking someone should take an intro to ethnic studies one time. Like maybe they would understand that you can use the word in a way that doesn't need to be banned, but can be critical. But it requires reading. It requires kind of thinking about it and not reflexively applying censorship, which is sometimes what people do, like they put filters in and you just can't use certain words. So I think what Racial Issues has done is really try to educate people. That's what's so good about that site to me.
Thank you. Most days.
Next
Oh
question.
wait, can I jump really quick on
Of
that
course,
one?
yeah.
So I spent a year at Stanford, and I had a lot of fun being like the black girl on Sand Hill Road, right? The Stanford person not on the track team. Like there's 1,001 things about being in that space. But one of the things that I always wish that I could like do writ large for tech companies was give them Ryu's talk from 2009 from Sarah Gadsden's conference, and I wrote the conference notes on racial issues. It was like Mixie and the Imagined Boundaries of Japan. And it was the first time I ever heard someone talk about coding inequality into your interface, right? But what happens? Later, after Ryu's talk, right, I became friends with Nguyen Kroll, who was a very prolific writer for Newsweek, who now runs a game design company called Hit Detection. And the first time that he was supposed to be going out testing the Connect would not read the darkness of his skin, right? There's a lot of things that we build in and take for granted that are coded in that we don't see because we assume, oh, well, everybody will be fine with this, but it is made for a certain bias. Who wrote on BuzzFeed? It was Brokey McPoverty, was it? Sarita McFadden, right. Sarita wrote this great piece on kind of like the color girl, as in like the white girl, in which they base colors on for film to make sure that the color is balanced correctly, right? And this huge struggle for black people trying to figure out why we're shooting ourselves wrong, right? And it's never coming out to this color balance. So there's all these different ways in which inequality is coded but doesn't necessarily get recognized as being coded that I think would be interesting for people to think about.
Actually, now that you sparked something in my mind, which is to say that the conversation about diversity in Silicon Valley and why there are so few people of color working at those companies is actually one that we would need like we would need a lot more time to talk about. And so that's, and then actually because of that, I do think that's sort of why I'm really okay with, outlets like the New Yorker or the New York Times, excising a piece of a very heated moment from Twitter, a hashtag that took off for a particular reason, and explaining it, because I do think that's one of the most effective modes of transportation of those ideas and that understanding. I mean, it's not necessarily Twitter's fault that they don't understand how people use their tools for social justice in this country, because I think there's a lot of talk about how Twitter is used in other parts of the world for revolutions and big movements, and those are obviously incredibly important, but I think it's a lot trickier when you're at Twitter to say, like, well, how, because they're probably as terrified as anyone else, about getting it wrong. And so I could only imagine from their position, like I'm sure they don't know how to deal with these things, and I'm sure they don't know how to talk about them, or they see it happening and they see stuff. What? Diversity. But until that happens, that's an incredibly useful way for them to understand, depending on who wrote the piece and how it's written, but that's an incredibly interesting and important thing for someone who's an outsider and someone who's not a part of that community. It's useful for me because I'm not a part of these communities, and I need to know what's going on without like tweeting at everyone, like, what is this? What's happening? What's going on? You know what I mean? It's like, it's an incredibly useful, it can be a very useful way to sort of talk about and elevate something, or at least sort of lift a conversation that's happening in a place where, in 24 hours it will be gone just because of the nature of the stream, and preserving it somewhere else and cataloged and SEO'd so like people can find it when they need to. And I think that's really important. And I also think that explains a little bit why, we know everyone has heard of the term like Black Twitter, but we don't talk about Black Instagram or Black Vine. We don't look at these other kind of subcultures and communities that are very, very healthy and active in a way, and involved in these other social media services, because people just don't know how to talk about these things. And I think that's part of it. And I think that's why people get so freaked out and are so wary, and talking about race is always throwing a bomb, or it's like kryptonite, or people freak out when someone uses a word or tries to make a joke, and sometimes it's very valid and it's very right, but I also think that we're in this funny adolescence phase of trying to come to agreement about how we're supposed to talk about race online, but none of us know, and none of us are, can say, here's the way you talk about race online. This is what you do. And I think that we're stuck in this phase of lecturing each other and education, trying to educate other people about how you have these conversations on Twitter, when frankly, I just don't ever know that we're gonna get to that place. But I think that's where a lot of the kind of tension that we've seen happen this year, and people freaking out about someone saying something a certain way, and is this a good hashtag, is this a good use of hashtag activism, or whatever it is. We're trying to come to agreement, and I think it's really hard.
So before you, I want to say that we need to talk about instrumentalizing fields, because I think that directly touches on Jenna, and catharsis, as Ayesha mentioned. And then I want you to answer, but then I want to take at least 2 more questions from the
Yeah, I'll take them. I don't need to answer.
Sure? You don't want to
let's
talk?
have a question. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was going to say real quick in terms of, because this is this ongoing struggle in media, and how do we cover these topics? And again, for me, it's the value of hashtags and the intersection of social justice and social media is that it's finally made undeniably clear to mainstream outlets the demand for and the impact of these conversations, whereas before they were allowed to ignore them because the communities for whom they mattered were invisible to these outlets. The question then becomes, though, in transferring viral hashtags or particularly compelling tweets to your website, to your column, to whatever mainstream outlet me, or even sharing them on the radio or on, Al Jazeera has a show dedicated to doing this, or shout out to the stream.
Thank you. The one I can't talk about. Go ahead.
So again, it becomes but oftentimes those tweets existed in a moment and space of catharsis, and to take that and turn it into education for everyone else. So someone else's catharsis, then it has to become education for everyone else, and naturally that's going to be ineffective, particularly when the people doing that transferring may not necessarily have the most insight into the motives and nature of that conversation, and their relationship to that catharsis is going to be very different. So you basically have people very gingerly handling something that they're not equipped to handle, and that they know they're not. So it's like it's fumbling because of, I think, very simple misunderstandings about what the nature and people's relationship to these conversations are. So in terms of how do we talk about this? How do we do this? Well, people are already talking about it. It happens. It's okay. I think what we really need to do is not be so caught up in people. And if people are self-censoring, if these outlets are worried about getting it wrong, good. They should be worried. And there are people out there that can show them how to get it right, and maybe those are the people who should be writing those columns instead.
Nice.
Next question.
Hi, so I feel like all of you have talked in different ways about wrestling with the personal experience of seeing certain ideas, whether positive or negative, surge in popularity at a particular moment. And it makes me think, and this is woefully imprecise, so I apologize, but I saw someone retweet someone else who tweeted someone that someone said at a conference that I don't know who they were and I wasn't at, that was if you think that anonymity on online platforms is all about turning people into assholes, then you've never been a person in an oppressed position who fears physical reparations for what you say. And I think about that more and more every day, and that it's easy in a certain way to be social media is extracting value from us, but then at the same time, that same social media might be giving a voice to a woman who's protecting herself from rape for the first time, as was in the last panel or something like that. So I guess the question is, do any of you personally see ideas that are otherwise compelling or excellent critiques or awesome theories that are surging in popularity that nonetheless inadvertently erase or discount the position or the experience of people of color or otherwise traditionally marginalized positions?
Yes.
I have very little patience for when people say things like outrage Twitter, or in general just focus on the manners of and tone of certain conversations rather than the wealth of everything else available. And in terms of to answer your question about what people get from social media versus what they give, and I'm sorry, remind me again what.
Are there theories that you think are coming to popularity now that are otherwise compelling, but secretly just sort of leave out the experience of people of color?
Well, what it makes me think of is the way people talk about emotion on these websites, and anger in particular, and whose anger is allowed and whose anger gets taken, is dismissed, and is assumed to be not particularly well informed or rational. And I'm sure, as we're all familiar, it's it's particularly women, particularly people of color, and it's just interesting to me that it's conversations led by them whose emotional currents get scrutinized, whereas everyone else by everyone else, I mean the anger of white males is more, people are more inclined to assume it's righteous versus the anger of, people behind hashtags, particularly on race and gender, are scrutinized for, being misplaced. And so what your question reminded me of is the way we determine the, rationality of of emotion on social media, because these are very emotional spaces, and they are often personal and affective first. So that's all.
The only thing, I'm sorry, because I do want to take another question, because I love that you're pushing that, Lisa, and I agree. The one thing I do want to point out too, though, is that we all these things are true, and everything that you said is 100% fair, and I just think in kind of to piggyback off your question a bit, I mean, I don't think we can deny that the way these conversations that do happen online, as valid and as important as they are impacted by the fact that everyone knows that there's someone watching, theoretically, that you do have an audience and you are performing, and even if you don't think you are performing. Because we're all performing. We're all performing a version of ourselves online that we want, and sometimes we do it because we want something to be transmitted, we want something to be transferable, and I do think that it's very, very difficult. Again, I think Twitter, all these things exist in the same space where something that's tweeted in catharsis or very earnestly or very self-righteously. I mean, there's no way to know the motivation or the intent behind any of these conversations, even if you are following someone. I see tweets all the time that I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like, I don't know. Like, I know you in real life, and I'm like, are you okay? Like, what's going on? Is that a joke? Is that real? It's impossible to know because of the mechanics of the tool. And so that is one actual downside of having these incredibly important and honest conversations on Twitter or on social media, even though they do perform the very incredible and important function of giving a voice and giving access to people who traditionally, wouldn't have any kind of outlet to be heard. But I do think we can't ignore, the very, very real kind of framework that anytime you're acting before an audience, it changes your behavior and kind of how you want to be perceived. And that's something I don't know what to do with it, but it's there.
So I'm going to change the format slightly. What we're going to do is we're going to let everybody in line ask their question, and I will do my best to record it in pen and ink. And then afterwards, I will volunteer the panel's time to answer your questions, but to give people a chance to start circulating and drinking some of that marvelous beer that has been supplied.
It's not marvelous.
Drink some of that PBR that's going to be. All right, so is that okay with the people? Okay, so that means that we love comment plus question, but it would help us if you had question. Come on up.
Hey, thank you for your time. My question is basically, Jenna, you said that these tools aren't ours and we didn't produce them. TextMob, which is this project that was a part of your Lisa's Twitter, was actually organized for communicating with police presence in different places during a protest. It was first used during the RNC protests in the city. And I think it's not a coincidence that that's been a big part of how Twitter has been used the world. I just want to ask, I guess, if there's a correlation between the sort of like fear of control and the fear of sort of this like good protester, bad protester dichotomy that happens a lot in the way we talk about like social unrest.
Good protester, bad protester, fear the troll?
Yeah, and like promotion of the citizen through like what's wrong to say, how we discuss things.
Okay, thank you. Next victim, question?
I'm a librarian at Bronx Community College.
Woo! Librarians!
And I go to like a million conferences called information literacy, and I get really frustrated about a lot of discussions, so I'm asking you guys for your definitions of information literacy. Thank you.
That's a good one. Come on up. Sorry, that line got shorter. What happened?
You touched actually on this a little bit while I was standing and waiting, but I was really struck by Ayesha's phrase towards the beginning where she said that disagreement about whether the internet is making our culture smarter, and I was wondering about this pronoun our, and the word community has been used a few times, and could you just kind of frame that community a little bit, because the conversation sometimes, especially online, especially when it gets heated, sometimes the conversation seems to be sit down and shut up and you might learn something. So it's more of an interactive, and sometimes it's this is not your conversation, go away. Mm-hmm. So what are kind of the dynamics or the limits of community or hour or culture or, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, just one more. I think I was hoping you guys could talk a little bit about how you navigate in as actual people in these newsrooms that you two work in, and I think also used to work in terms of thinking about like the hierarchies of those newsrooms and how they work. You're these certain people online. Jenna, you just said we're always all performing online. You're convening these digital spaces. How does that translate into the actual 9 to 5 jobs you have to do every day?
That's it?
All right.
One from the web.
Go for it.
How will net neutrality impact the questions about race happening online right now?
The same way literacy requirements affected black slaves' attempts to become literate, not much. As long as you don't get caught. I'm sorry, that was flip. I apologize. So one of the things I do want to say, because I get to close out the panel, because I'm the moderator. Oh, do I need this? Do I really need this? Really? Oh, for the feet. Hey, people in the back. One of the things I do want to say is that I'm encouraged by the ways in which you guys thoughtfully talked about the perspectives that you have on the web, but I'm also troubled, right? Because I style myself as an empirical humanist. And when I talk about social movements or black people on the web, I find that it's incredibly useful to set out the terms under which they engage with the web. So if I'm talking about Black Twitter, and I have, it's in Journal of Broadcasting and Educational Media. Sorry, plug. If I talk about Black Twitter, I can't just talk about the few black people who might have run a hashtag that I found of interest. So my usual, when I was doing job talks last year, my favorite hashtag was ho shit, right? Because everybody understands what ho shit is, even if you don't have a ho. Or not. But in any case, just explaining the discourse or the social interaction patterns of people without explaining the ways in which that technology mediates their interactions, to me you're doing short shrift to your role as an internet new media researcher. So I didn't mean for this to be a corrective, but I want to say this, there's something to keep in mind. So the question I asked earlier about platform politics, I think it's really important because there are certain things that are available to Twitter users that are not available to Tumblr users. And I think that really works to structure the types of discourses that are available. So how do you express femininity in 140 characters, right? How do you express femininity if you can have an image and 1,000 reblogs, right? Those things will be different, and I think it's incumbent upon us to consider those differences as we talk about the ways in which race is presented online. The last piece, and the thing that I didn't get to talk about, and I really wanted to, is critical whiteness, right? And I think it's really important to talk about that, and it always goes under the radar, and I think it's important to talk about it in terms of glitch racism, but I also think it's really important in terms of the way that it structures representations, right? So there's an extremely popular web series called Awkward Black Girl, right? And I never thought that we would need to have a show called Awkward Black Girl, because I know awkward black girls, and I didn't think they were necessarily not represented well in the mainstream. But the popularity of that show tells me something different, right? And so in a space that doesn't necessarily allow for the construction of race apart from discursive and visual representations, how important is it to us to continue representing ourselves, right, on these various web platforms? And how important is it to the white people, right? So we come back to this topic of cultural appropriation and Miley Cyrus, right? Is Miley Cyrus intelligible without cultural appropriation of twerking black women, right? Is Jessica Simpson intelligible ever? I mean, is Jessica Simpson intelligible if you don't contrast her against the fact that she's an American citizen, and there are thousands of other black starlets who are similarly as intelligent, or more so, right? But that have not achieved her popularity, right? So I think it's something, it's also something to be considered where whiteness comes back into the conversation as a way to structure it. So racism, yes, but also in terms of what representations are available, valid, and visible. And I can give y'all closing words. Would y'all like closing words?
You can't like lightning round it out. Can we lightning round it out?
Leg it out, leg it out.
I just want to say that, Ayesha, what you said about people getting it wrong and then learning how to get it right is just perfect. I mean, that's exactly how it's supposed to work, and I can only hope that the platform will allow it to work that way. You know, I mean, the things that make those things function, we don't really have that much access to. So.
Well, thank you for that. And also just to try to answer the previous question a little bit, and in terms of communities and relationships to these, I mean, a lot of times it's just a self-awareness, like just because we have access to something, and again, I'm using these maybe vague pronouns, but just because there is access to something doesn't mean that there is an entitlement to that product or that conversation or to that space, which again goes back to the way media outlets may want to cover Twitter conversations. Just because it's popular doesn't mean that I feel like now there's places feel like they have to weigh in on something when it's really not conversation that concerns them. It's enough to just let it happen. That is the value in it, and it doesn't need a mediator to now make it uniquely accessible to the public. Twitter is the public. Just let it be. And in terms of I just don't feel like it's already such something that's mediated enough that adding mediators to me is not the response. And thank you guys so much for sharing the space for me. I really liked being here with such brilliant women.
Agree. Yes, this has been great. I feel like I've been taking notes the whole time. I feel like I'm learning so much. I feel like I'm back in college. It's great. The only thing I want to say is just that, if 2014 was the year that everyone started talking about race, let's not let 2014 be the only year that everyone started talking about race. Let's keep talking about race. Let's keep talking about sexism. Let's keep talking about social justice online. Let's keep talking about all these things that are just so incredibly important, and that we're only just starting to really, I don't know the expression, like breach the whatever. We're just at the tip of the iceberg. So let's just keep it top of mind, and when we get tired of it, tell ourselves that there's a reason that we're tired of it, because it's that it's still very important, and we've got to keep going, and we just haven't gotten to the point yet where we have to stop talking. We can stop talking about it. So I don't know.
So to conclude for me, I think trying to tie in as many of the comments as possible. One of the biggest things that I've found in my digital journey, and I think I am the least formally educated person on this panel.
Oh.
I know, shut up, André. We know each other very well, unfortunately. But yeah, I'm the person without the bachelor's degree. I didn't come up in academia, y'all. This is all libraries and the internet, right? So for me, the reason I went into media was because people were always talking about me, but never talking to me. And I tried to figure out why that was. And the more, and particularly being in DC media, which is very pedigree focused, it's been really interesting to kind of ascend those ranks, and one of the reasons why I ultimately ended up joining the stream, and as their senior digital producer. That's what I do. So it's an interesting thing, but when you engage in space and engage in power, I think to piggyback off of what Jenna just said, it's important not just to be like, we're having conversations about race, because we're always having conversations about race, right? Carmen Van Kerkhove, the founder of Racialicious, her and Jen Chow actually founded it. I just own it now. Carmen Van Kerkhove used to say that we need to look at productive conversations about race. Like, how do we actually move things forward? Because a lot of times we get involved in these weird circles of, this is what should be happening or shouldn't be happening. Or these explainers by people who are not of a certain background, or these people who need to be or are of a certain background and feel like they need to explain how we are to other people without recognizing humanity. Like, there's all of these things tied into it that we just cannot get into in 2 minutes, but we can totally say at least understanding that there is a very, very large world and that we need to be able to exist in it together. And I think if everyone led from that framework, like, it doesn't matter what you learned or the academic books or the terms or how the fuck you pronounce hegemony or any of those things. Like, what matters is that you love and you trust people enough to want to be in the same space with them. I don't understand shit about trans history or trans rights, but I understand that I love Maddie Bryce and I love Naomi Clark and I love all the fabulous trans game designers that I have met through being a gamer. And I want a world with them in it, and that is it. I don't need to know anything else, right? I need to understand what they need to be happy and they need to be free, and then we work toward that together. That's all I want people to understand.
So one more round of applause for these fabulous women and this